Uh, Hello, I'm Phoenix Andrews. I'm a writer for many years in all kinds of different genres. I was accidentally a poet and spoken word artist for a while. I've written sketches and plays, and then I did journalism for a bit during the Brexit years, and I developed this idea about politics and fandom where people react to politics like fans of anything else. That eventually became a book. And I'm an academic researcher apart from that. And I was doing a PhD while I was pitching the book and finishing it while I was writing the book. And the PhD was nothing to do with politics, even though I ended up working in a politics research job for a while off the back of the writing I'd done about politics. So I effectively did two lots of research at the same time. The research I was doing for my PhD, which was about open access to research policy, my politics and fandom work. And since I've done my PhD, I've done a lot more work that's actually been more about media and queer theory, some of which came into my PhD, and fandom of different things, not just politics. But my current job is also not to do with that because the job market is what it is. So that's closer to working on stuff around policy and stakeholder engagement, but also creative research methods, which came into my PhD and other stuff as well. And activism I've been involved in for quite a long time. I used to be involved in quite a lot of feminist activism. I've done quite a lot of LGBTQ plus activism and also disability activism. I was an ambassador for the National Autistic Society when they first started having those. And I've done quite a lot of stuff around autism and ADHD and disability more generally.
Do you want to explore the stuff that you've done about ADHD, autism, that activism, and also the areas of disability? Because I know it's something that yourself, you are autistic and
Mm.
have ADHD, I think, yourself.
Yeah, that's right. So I got diagnosed with all of my disabilities quite late because I also have cerebral palsy. And I was about 20 when I got diagnosed with that by a neurologist because I'd been at college doing drama and performance and they asked us to do some dance stuff. And the dance teacher was like, hang on, there's something not right here. You should go and get it checked out and make sure it's not anything progressive, a tumor or MS or anything like that. So I got diagnosed with cerebral palsy then and sort of started identifying as disabled. And then when I was 30, I got diagnosed with autism and had all of the zeal of quite a lot of newly diagnosed people, I think, to try and find out everything about it and then do activism around it. Partly for people who everyone was saying, oh, you don't seem autistic, you don't look autistic, or you've done all right at school, you can't be autistic. And then the ADHD diagnosis came when I was 40, towards the end of my PhD, partly because of the length of time you have to wait to get a diagnosis in the UK. But like a lot of people, I suppose, I saw other people around me getting diagnoses, and there were things that were happening for me that weren't couldn't be attributed to autism or mental health or cerebral palsy. So I looked into the ADHD stuff. And when I was having my diagnosis for that, they also had to try and unpick it from the other things because it's all to do with the brain, but they were like, oh no, you've quite clearly got mixed type ADHD. And I suppose I've been on a bit of a quest for people to try and better understand themselves. So not so much rant about what autism and ADHD are or aren't, but to help people think about the world in a different way, that perhaps they're not failing, perhaps the world is failing them, and what coping might look like for different people. Because I found a lot of the guides and stuff that are for autistic people and people with ADHD didn't really work for me. I think we're all different in how we present and how it affects us. And you need to find things that work for you. And then, of course, like getting people to understand hidden disabilities and neurodivergence. I get very upset when people get into neurodivergence being a superpower because it is. And it's, for me, it's like it's a difference that causes difficulties and has some benefits, but like just alternative ways of thinking and being. But I don't want people to just think about what's wrong with them. Like I did work on a research project for several years as a researcher that was about autistic students transitioning from school and college to the first year of university. And obviously I drew on my own experience for that, but was interviewing and doing surveys and stuff with people across multiple different countries, we found that people who didn't get the support that they needed by Christmas, students who didn't get the support they needed by Christmas in their first term at university, were most likely to drop out. And that a lot of autistic students and students with ADHD and students with both were dropping out, but they were getting some of the best grades out of all disability groups if they managed to get to the end of their course. The sort of employment outcomes are much worse. That's another piece of work that I know a lot of people have been doing stuff on more recently, but I just thought that was a really stark bit of information to talk about to universities and schools, but also in workplaces and in life and to all sorts of different people, that if people don't get the support at the right time, and if they don't know that they're autistic or don't know that they have ADHD, because a lot of the people we talked to didn't get diagnosed straight away, and because university and elsewhere just assumes that everyone can cope with things as they are unless they're told otherwise, and you have to go to this massive effort to try and get any kind of support or any kind of acknowledgement that there might be different ways of doing things. We were trying to explain to not just disability advisors, but like university managers and parents and other people that if you made things generally more accessible rather than something you had to access via support systems, then it'd make it better for people who were diagnosed, people who weren't diagnosed, and people who were diagnosed and didn't tell anyone. Because 2/3 of neurodivergent students don't tell anyone at university that they're autistic. They don't identify as disabled. They don't want people to know, even if you tell them that not everyone does have to know, or even if you tell them it's not a bad thing for people to know. So if you make everything about trying to make things better for your experience, about filling in forms, which is not good for people who have ADHD anyway. It's kind of ironic that you have to go through all of this filling in forms and focusing on things that are really difficult for you to try and get anywhere and be really persistent. But if you make it all about that, then a lot of the people you're trying to help just won't have anything. And the outcomes of that project were like guides for all the different sort of groups around managing all this stuff at university, but also an online toolkit that various universities have implemented that anyone can access. So it wasn't something that just people who had disabled students allowance or had told the university that they were autistic could access, just like anybody could, that gave ideas and ways of working through things that might be difficult for people starting university, ways of working through it. It's an open source system, so a whole bunch of places have done that, and that was at least felt like a positive outcome, because sometimes you feel like when you're doing activism, you're shouting into the void, or you're just making people aware of feeling things. And I think a lot of people are aware of autism and ADHD now, but they don't necessarily understand it.
Going back to the point where you said you want people to have that persistent where they're able to go on a quest where they better understand themselves, and you encourage people to explore their disease and how it affects them or how it presents with them, because as she was saying, that some of the information you might find in a leaflet that's when you're getting diagnosed, or the information out there can be not as helpful or not fully representative of the neurodivergent experience. What has been your path to learn about yourself, and what are the things that you learned from your own experience and your own experience being disabled?
I think a lot of it was about learning not to think that I was a terrible person or broken, which sounds like really obvious or maybe a bit trite, but because I didn't have any diagnoses as a kid or a teenager or at school or anything like that, I was being told all the time at home and at school that I wasn't underworked, that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I was rude, that I was making problems for myself, that I just needed to apply myself and concentrate and all of that kind of thing, and that my friendships were falling apart because I was a difficult person. And so being able to unpick all of that and not feel like I was a mess and go, it's not ever an excuse if you act poorly, if you have hurt people, because impact is more important than intent in a lot of ways. But understanding how I might have made those mistakes where I upset people and how I could possibly like avoid that was helpful. a lot of what was helpful for me was reading lots of people's different experiences like online, because a lot of the things like say like leaflets or people who perhaps were on telly talking about neurodivergence, I couldn't really relate to. I wasn't lining up trains. I'm not a loner or antisocial. I seem weird, but not necessarily a way that people
Yeah.
always recognize as autistic. So I wasn't getting the grace that people who seem more obviously fitting at what people understand of autism were getting. So like early social media, online diaries like LiveJournal and stuff like that was partly how I got my autism diagnosis. And then people on Twitter and Instagram and so on talking about ADHD. Not to say that, oh, I was influenced to say that. It's
Yeah.
not, but like I just started to recognize more in their experiences than things that I'd seen elsewhere. And it helped me to understand why certain things had happened or I'd reacted in a certain way. And I went to some conferences and talks, and I saw the academic Luke Bearden, who's also autistic, speak. And I think he's autistic. Anyway, he said something that's always stuck with me, that most people have the same sort of phenotype of brain. Their brains work roughly the similar way. And it's not that they're mind readers, it's that if they make an assumption about what somebody else is thinking or why they've reacted in a certain way or why they're behaving like they are, it's a reasonable assumption to assume that it's similar to them or somebody in their experience previously, and that autistic people have not just have a different phenotype, but have lots of different phenotypes. So we're different from each other and different from the mainstream. And I think that goes for all of the neurodivergences really as well, for ADHD and dyspraxia and dyscalculia as well, that it's not just, it's the same as everyone else and then this one thing is different. It's, or we're the same as each other. We're not, we're very different. So you can have people who are autistic or have ADHD or both, who have conflicting needs, and that you won't automatically get on just because like you both share that characteristic in common, or you won't necessarily understand each other. But what you can do once you know that you have this difference and you know that people are making these assumptions and they can't actually mind read, they're just going making reasonable assumptions, is you have to go, right, so the first assumption that I make, that someone will be understand things the same way I do, or that they'll react the same way I do, is going to be wrong most of the time. So I'm going to have to look for half a dozen other explanations or ask them. And that makes things a bit less brutal and gives life a bit less friction if you also don't make assumptions. It's rubbish that other people do get to walk through life just assuming things, and then most of the time it'll work out, and it doesn't work out if they're talking to an autistic person, but it does work out with everyone else.
Yeah.
It helps us a bit to go, okay, the thing that I first think is that this interpretation of this piece of writing or what this person is saying or what this person is doing probably isn't right. It's also good to assume that they don't hate you, because my first assumption is like the rejection sensitive dysphoria thing, that someone is reacting like that because they don't like you. Um, one thing learning more about neurodivergence and how people behave and stuff like that has taught me is that most of the time people are in their own world, and how they react to you or how they talk to you or when they've left you out of things or whatever, apart from when you're like a 6-year-old girl because they're brutal to each other, they're not really trying to exclude you or they're not really trying to be horrible to you. It's because of something that's going on in their head or their life that has nothing to do with you. So reminding yourself most of the time it's got nothing to do with you, because it has been really helpful for me. I think I'm not necessarily brilliant at empathy. I know Damien Milton talks about the double empathy problem, and that we supposedly as neurodivergent people don't understand other people, and that people who are neurotypical don't understand people who are neurodivergent. And I think that's true, because it's like a whole lot of assumptions happening
Yeah.
on both sides. But I think we all, whatever our brain is doing, need to understand that other people have got their own crap going on. When I used to work
Yeah.
in retail and people would kick off at me, I understood then that people weren't kicking off at me because I'd done something wrong or because they hated me. It's because they'd walked into the shop in a mood because something
Yeah.
had happened in their life. But then when it's people in your own life that you're close to and they're doing that, you do assume that it's something about you. Or if somebody responds to you in a particular way, you do assume that it's because they don't like you or you've upset them. And now I know it probably isn't that, but also it's okay to ask. It's better to go, oh, are you upset with me, than to walk off and assume.
I kind of think it tends to be based on what we can expose to in society and environments we grow up in. Because as you say that sometimes, you do get that negative stereotypes around being autistic.
Mm,
That, for when you're saying about people who might want to not be open being diagnosed in university,
mm,
as you say, some people will not disclose their diagnosis
mm,
in university. Can be because of masking and whatever, or
mm,
just some negative stereotypes within society that can cause that seed of the doubt within rejection sensitive dysphoria. So sometimes that can be linked to the environment we've grown up in or been
mm.
exposed to.
Totally. And if you've had a lot of horrible experience, if you've been bullied or left out of things or had people cut you out of their life for things that you now know, oh, that was because I was autistic and they've assumed that I was trying to hurt them. I wasn't. Then that colors your future interactions with people, that you come to it with that kind of upset assumption
Yeah.
that people aren't going to like you. But ultimately, it doesn't help, and it makes you more lonely if you're more suspicious of people.
I think an impact is, as well as you said before, about how some people might see autism as like a negative thing in the lens, or it's something that it could be something wrong with or suffer with, or sometimes some people view it as a superhero type thing, and that with ADHD as well. I
Mm,
think it's that view of people's judgments and views of disability that can also impact it, because what can, it doesn't help is not having that neutral view on disability and having that nuanced thing of kind of giving like a whole community a kind of generalized angle of what it is, rather than, you know, just looking at a person, in terms of the lens of their disability, and then understand negative or positive views that can are quite negative, doing bad than good, if you get.
when you're younger, and even when you get a diagnosis, stuff like that, nobody's teaching you about the social model of disability. They're not teaching you that there's the thing that is your impairment, and that does impair you. Otherwise, you wouldn't have got a diagnosis in the first place. The psychologist who diagnosed me said, look, lots of people do have autistic traits, but they either don't have enough of them to get a diagnosis, or it's not really having enough of a negative impact on their lives for it to be helpful to have a diagnosis. It can just be helpful for them to know about those things, but it's all about like negative side of things. And so, yeah, the impairment is real, but a lot of the things that impair you, or the social things, are living in a world that's not set up for you, where there are horrible sensory environments where you do get overwhelmed and people don't really understand it, where people don't give you the grace in social situations when you need a bit longer to process things, or you've misunderstood what somebody said and they won't say it again a different way to make sure that you've got it. You're not really told about that. So you just go, oh, I've got this thing that's really negative. And another reason people gave for not telling anybody that they had a disability at university, or people don't want to tell people at work, is because they didn't have a choice about that when they were younger, because they were diagnosed young, and when their parents advocated for them and everything like that, and they had, say, a teaching assistant sitting with them all the time, or they sat on a special table at primary school for people who needed extra time or extra help, and they just didn't want to be that visibly different. And it doesn't matter how many times you say it's not like that at, say, university or in the workplace, that you can get the help you need without it necessarily being a massively visible thing. But also, it's okay to tell people about it, and people aren't going to be weird if you explain what it means for you. They just have this barrier to it because they just think everyone's just going to think I'm a weirdo, and that is a barrier to me fitting in. And the older you get, the more you realize that trying to mask is a barrier to you fitting in, more than being open with people about what you are. Like when you can say to your friends, oh, I'm going to have to leave and go home early now, and it's nothing to do with you guys, I love you, it's just like it's been really noisy and there's been a lot of people around and I just need to go. That's much better for you and fitting in than toughing it out and then looking really grumpy and upset and then not being able to go anywhere with your friends for 2 weeks afterwards because you're completely burnt out by it. But that kind of takes age and a bit of that self-knowledge about what you can and can't do and what works for you in terms of getting out of a situation or dealing with the situation that isn't just avoiding everything. It takes time to work out what works for you because it can be easy and tempting to just avoid everything that's stressful.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to ask you as well, because, yeah, as I said, you've been late diagnosed cerebral palsy later than the typical age of diagnosis. How do you feel that being later diagnosed when it typically what is recognised with and diagnosed with cerebral palsy?
Yeah, I think it's hard because there's literally nothing that exists for people with cerebral palsy beyond the age of 18 because the assumption is that you're diagnosed in young childhood and then you have physiotherapy, maybe support with understanding what it is to be disabled. You have some people have things like Botox injections in muscles that are giving them trouble and stuff like that. You meeting other people who have the same disability as you is more likely to happen because of support groups and stuff like that. But because it's seen as a childhood condition, even though you have it your entire life, and it makes your
Yeah.
body age faster if you have cerebral palsy because you're using more energy and more of your muscles and stuff all the time to do the same stuff as other people. There's only really been a relatively small amount of research about adults with cerebral palsy specifically, and there's not really any services. So if I'd been diagnosed younger, I probably would have had fewer like physical problems, and I would also have met more physically disabled people earlier. Because while it's lovely that like neurodivergence and mental health are properly recognized as part of disability now, and a lot more people identify as disabled, it does mean that when you go to spaces or events for disabled people, a lot of the people don't have a physical impairment. And those who do have a very obvious physical impairment in that they're using a mobility device like a wheelchair or crutches, or they're visually impaired, or they have a hearing impairment. And so you can't really see yourself within that. I only really met a lot of other people with cerebral palsy because after the 2012 Paralympics, I took up disability athletics and I did para athletics, and I got to meet a lot of other people with cerebral palsy. So look at why and other disabilities, like lots of like I met loads of amputees and learned loads about that as well, and visually impaired people with spina bifida, like just like a wide range of disability, and just learning a lot more about the difference between congenital disabilities, ones you're born with and ones you acquire, and how they interact with other disabilities you might have. Like some people with cerebral palsy have, just like a lot of people with autism have learning disabilities and an intellectual impairment, not in like the American sense where they mean like a learning difficulty like dyslexia. And quite a lot of people have epilepsy, and how all of these things interact and how to live an independent life. And I learned a lot. I learned most about disability from being around more disabled people in the real world, if you like.
Yeah.
Not that online isn't the real world, but it presents a certain picture of things that isn't necessarily reflective of the whole of reality. It's not that representative. And I feel like if I'd been diagnosed earlier, I would have met more disabled people earlier and just learned a lot more stuff and felt more comfortable with my place in the world with it.
It is something that you would wish to be diagnosed with earlier, and you would want to see more understanding of like cerebral palsy symptoms that if that might be more subtle and more invisible to untrained medical professionals.
Yeah, there's some things like post-condition syndrome that I only learned from other people with cerebral palsy because I wasn't told about it when I was diagnosed. It was all quite quick with the neurologist, and there was like one follow-up appointment and that was it. And I wasn't given even like the leaflets I was given after autism and ADHD diagnosis. There was nothing. So there's no help for you. It's just here. No, that was it. And post-condition syndrome is like involves like fatiguing quicker and unexplained aches and pains and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, that's where that's come from. It's not just me being over 40 and getting older. Some of it might be, but some of it is to do with the particular interactions with aging and being physically active and then having this disability. And that helps me then to work out how to pace myself and manage it, and which things I need to like query with medical professionals and which things I just have to live with. And that's quite important. Like one of the things that was like a revelation for me with the Paralympics is obviously Channel 4 have dropped all the superheroes branding now because disabled people were like, no, we are not your inspiration porn. Like our impairments are real. We're not superheroes. Or all athletes who are elite athletes are superheroes in that sense because they do things that other people absolutely can't do, whether they've got a disability or not. But like all of those sort of early adverts for the Paralympics in 2012 on Channel 4 had people who looked disabled in. And so they had visually impaired athletes wearing their sunglasses, they had blade runners, amputees, they had people in wheelchairs, and they had little people, people of restricted growth. And so like those people, what people think of as Paralympic sport. They think Johnny Peacock, they think Hannah Cockcroft, Ellie Simmons, but 70% of Paralympic athletes are ambulant, so they walk, and they don't look disabled, but they do have a physical disability. So that's a real hidden disability to me, because not that neurodivergence and mental health aren't hidden, and they are, but that somebody could be physically struggling, their muscles are really tight because it's cold, or they're in a lot of pain, or they just can't walk that far, or they can't really see, and you just wouldn't know. And the biggest group at the Paralympics about any disability group is cerebral palsy. And that's what inspired me to take up running, even though I was quite old at the time. I was over 30. It's weird to take up athletics having not been sporty at all at that age. Although I got onto like a British athletics development program and stuff, I got quite far out of just sheer bloody mindedness. But it's just something that you don't know until other disabled people point it out to you. Like with visually impaired athletes, because there's so many levels of like classification, only the ones with the most severe impairments are wearing sunglasses or have a guide dog or walk with a stick are obvious when they're a visual impairment. Quite often it's like they've got part of their vision missing, at least at that stage in their life, or with their condition that they've got, and you just wouldn't know to look at
Yeah,
them.
as you say, it's that kind of still stigma that we're still working through in society of learning and becoming more educated on, because I guess it's for yourself that you picked power sport later on in life, 30 years, like at that age, because it's that something that growing up you didn't know that you had a physical disability. And I think for some people who may have physical disabilities that, as I say, that might be a bit more and that can be hidden as well. I think sometimes there's that thing they might struggle to get on and pee throughout school in the mainstream environment, and there isn't much of adapted sports for for the rest of the disabled population, if you get me, into that sports accessibility.
Yeah, it's really bad because when I was trying to get into the disabled athletics, there was disabled athletics in my area, but it was all for people with learning disabilities to help keep them active. So I was mostly with people who had Down syndrome and then some other learning disabilities. And there wasn't anything that for people who weren't children who wanted to do disabled sport. There was some stuff for wheelchair users to have a go at wheelchair basketball and stuff like that, but there wasn't anything for people who couldn't just do mainstream stuff, but it's to do with funding, but didn't have like particular conditions that would lend themselves towards that. It was very hard even to find out about stuff. The sports officer at the local council was trying to help me, and even she was like struggling to work out what you could do or how a gym would alter their processes. I have a PT who is works entirely online now, although we did do face-to-face stuff before for a bit. And his business is called Outsiders Training Club because he realized most of the people he was training were LGBTQ plus, disabled, or had chronic illness. That meant that they felt like they were excluded by gyms and excluded by classes, and they just didn't really belong. And he taught himself some sign language to work with deaf clients. He's done training on like working with people with anxiety and neurodivergence, and he's always certainly got ADHD himself. Working with him is great because he tries to adapt things, not just physically, but in terms of like how I can get my brain around something where I don't understand the instructions, or but my body doesn't really know what to do with this. I don't know
Yeah.
how to put it together. And he understands that might be an issue. Whereas I did a pole dancing course and people are really strong. And I'm strong, right? I weightlift 3 to 4 times a week and I do yoga and Pilates and stuff. So I'm not weak. It's not like I come to it from doing nothing. And they just had no idea what to do with someone who couldn't immediately grab their legs on the pole and hang off it. Like they were trying to show you how to do spins and stuff like that, but they had no idea how to adapt it at all. And there were other people who also had problems and they all dropped out by week 2 or 3. And I stuck it till the end to see if they could improve, but they just had no idea. You might have to work at different levels with people on an introduction course.
Goes back to when you were saying about that there's a lot of research to do with disability and neurodivergent conditions to be done. And this is something that I guess there's still a lack of investment in the sports sector to research and understand how to adjust sports to make sure they are accessible and inclusive to support disabled bodies and disabled minds, because it's a thing that if you're not neurodivergent or having that disability yourself, then for some people they might find it difficult to actually really adapt how that body and mind works and how what is needed in that place.
That's it. They just didn't really seem to have any understanding of that. When I'd started doing the disability athletics for a bit, I went and worked for a little while with a strength and conditioning coach and physio team in Nottingham who'd worked with Paralympians because I wanted to see what I could do to help improve things. Because at the time, I walked in a very awkward way. The way I'd walked all my life with my feet out at 10 to 2 was like my mum would say, like on the clock. It caused problems with my knees and my hips, and it was not very stable. I still struggle with balance and stuff, particularly when it's cold because my muscles are tight, or if there's any ice, I'm going to struggle with that. But I walked awkwardly and it was causing problems with running, which is what I was doing. And they were able to help break things down and make it so that I could walk with my feet in a straight line. And my walking is now so much better, but I'd never had that like through the medical system or through school or anything like that. It was considered like you're walking like that because you're ornery. You're just doing that because you enjoy it, or you could just try. And they couldn't see why. Or you can just turn your feet in, you can just turn your feet in. I couldn't. They had to like break it down over weeks for me to be able to do it. And I had this massive improvement, but that's because they'd worked with a lot of people with different disabilities in different sports and had worked out a way of explaining what would seem obvious to somebody who like does sports stuff. Like for them certain things is just obvious and they don't get why either you don't get it intellectually or
Yeah.
why the body doesn't get it, because they'd had to work past all these barriers with different people with different needs. They'd worked out different ways to explain it. And if something wasn't working for me, then they go, okay, we'll try this thing that we tried with Ollie. Okay, we'll do that and we'll see if that works. They had a bunch of different things in their toolbox for trying. Whereas like in the mainstream of sport, and I think in the mainstream of a lot of teaching of all kinds of different skills and subjects, people haven't thought about different ways to approach it. And yet when I have done lecturing and stuff like that, I've often been working with not just people with neurodivergence, which is more and more common, obviously, but also with a lot of international students, and they may not understand the language, or they might understand the language but not understand the context. And you learn different ways of how to explain a concept so that everybody gets it. And you might try the one that you think is the most universally accessible to start with, but you also you look at the people in your audience, you go, okay, some of them have got it, some of them don't. You try explaining the same thing then a different way until everyone has got it. And that's what you need to do to include everyone, not just go, this is the way to do it, or other people need to have extra sessions to work it out. You have to try to bring everybody in, and I'm not sure everyone's there yet.
And I think it's the thing of being neurodivergent. It's part of the minority in society, so we used to having the means of like rephasing or recommunicating things so we can adapt to explain and help neurotypical people understand what we mean and what we meant in terms of how we want to communicate, and because they might not socialize or communicate in the same way. And for the majority of neurotypical people, if they haven't been used to people with divergent neurotypes, there's that thing that you haven't had that much experience to adapt and to communicate what you need to do and how you thinking through something and the whole process of how the mind works for a task. Yeah, you're just not used to it, and you just used to be the obvious.
That's it. And I think that people haven't really realized how many neurodivergent people and other disabled people basically just self-exclude because you have bad experiences, you just leave. And they don't know why that person has left or not come back to something. But they don't think, oh, maybe it wasn't that accessible. They don't even consider that. But like lots of people just assume that something isn't for them, so they won't go in the first place, or they go once it hasn't been made accessible for them and they just won't go again. They just don't come back. In a way, we have to be bloody minded and put ourselves in the line of fire sometimes and just keep going back until people have to are forced to change
Yeah,
what they're doing and to go, actually, I fancy trying this thing, so I'm gonna try this thing, rather than just going, I can't do that because I'm autistic or they won't include me. They're gonna have to include me. I have my differences with Baroness and Dame Tanny Gray Thompson on many different topics, but I do admire the way that she'll just like physically drag herself down a train to show them that she needs to get to a toilet and she isn't able to, or that she needs the assistance to get off the train. She won't just quietly resolve the situation and then not say anything about it or write a polite letter later. She makes visible what the issue is, because sometimes that's what you have to do, even if it's embarrassing, even if it's stressful, because otherwise society won't change. It needs to understand that the problem is there and that it's far more common than they think. Like
yeah.
the BBC journalist Sean Dilley did a thread on Blue Sky, and I think also probably on Twitter, like over the past few days, about being blind and being a guide dog user and all the times he keeps getting refused and also service and also people being rude to him. And it was amazing. I mean, obviously some people were just rude in the comments, but it was amazing how many people didn't realize that kind of going, this is illegal, isn't enough. Like that even somebody who's got all the privileges that he has of being a visible journalist that people know about, people know he has some status in society, that still he gets refused service nearly every day. He has problems nearly every day. And non-disabled people just thought saying it's illegal or saying, of course you've got to accept guide dogs. And then people started fighting him back, going, oh, if people are allergic to dogs, a lot of people are allergic to dogs now, so maybe you can't go in the restaurant. And he was like, no, that's not really how it works. You separate people as much as possible, but being allergic to dogs isn't the same as being blind and needing to have a guide dog.
It just comes back to having a straw hat argument where it just ends up being a load of whataboutism, see if you get what I mean, just.
Hmm.
And one thing that I want to bring you on the podcast to chat
Yeah.
about is your book, Iron Heart Politics. Do you want to explain how you came up with the idea of doing this book and what made you want to write a book on this topic?
Basically, I've been talking online and at conferences quite a lot about this idea of politics being like fandom, because I'd been in fandom spaces since I was a teenager, really, fanzines and then fan sites when they came along and stuff like that. And I noticed people, not just like obvious things like fans of Donald Trump, because obviously people have seen them at rallies and with their hats and t-shirts and all stuff like that, or Jeremy Corbyn, but to do with issues around Brexit, like culture war things, all sorts. People were acting like football fans or acting like fans of a band, that they'll defend the thing that they love to the death and they'll attack people who aren't fans of that thing or are fans of something else. And I really wanted to explore that in more detail and explain to people, look, that's why your family member has gone completely crazy about Nigel Farage, like in either direction. Either they're obsessed with hating him or obsessed with loving him, because it's become like a full, like a team allegiance for them now, that's is part of who they are. When I talk about fandom, I say there's like several components to it other than a strong interest and attachment to the object of your fandom. There's also that it becomes part of your identity. So if somebody attacks it, they're attacking part of who you are, but you can also be proud of having that as part of your identity, and you'll tell people about it. There's the sort of community aspect that you can find other people who share your interests, and that's one of the loveliest things about fans. I mean, it can be scary when there's a huge number of people who are into something terrible, but if you find other people and a sense of community based on that shared interest, it's really lovely. And lots of people found for the first time a political voice and people who are interested in the same stuff as them online, where they'd only really talk to people that they knew from home or work or whatever online before that. And then the third aspect is the to join, because if you don't intend to join the fray, be part of something, then you won't. To be part of a fandom, you're standing up and going, this is me, this is what I'm into, these are the other people who are into this thing. And I felt it was an idea I could explore over a book with lots of different examples for good and bad, and explaining why people were reacting the way that they did and the sort of psychology behind that and how it had happened throughout history. And thankfully, an agent agreed with me, and then a publisher. And obviously, being able to hyper focus with the research for the book, I read so many books. There are so many shadow versions of the book because all of the chapters I wrote that didn't make the final version, because the process of editing is quite brutal, but you have to get to something where you're telling one coherent story and journey through your idea that will make sense to the most amount of people. But there are lots of other versions where I went down a rabbit hole about something that could exist in the world.
But the theme of the book being focused on the more so political fandoms almost feels a bit like a neurodivergent thing, because many neurodivergent people may not be political fandoms, but fandoms of Doctor Who, Star Trek,
Yeah.
etc. Might be involved in so many communities. Do you think that, in terms of exploring this book, do you think it has come from personal focused interests?
I mean, I always say if you
Yeah.
go to a Doctor Who event, you're never the most autistic person in the room, because there'll be somebody who knows the date of transmission of every single episode and what format it was on, or can tell you about every extra. That's Toby Haydock, the comedian and actor, can tell you about every single extra who's ever been in Doctor Who practically, and what other things that they've done. You'll find other people like you, which is a beautiful thing, and other people who are in something as you, but you'll never be the most intense person in the room about that special interest. And you'll find people who will not be bored about you talking about it, which can be an issue with special interests. If you try to tell people in your day-to-day life who don't share it, they never want that level of detail that you're prepared to give them. So fandom communities give you that place where you can find a social life, but also not bore people, which is a positive thing. I think the other sort of way that neurodivergence comes into it is that often the ideas I have for like a book or an article or an academic paper or whatever, people go, oh, I would never have thought to put those things together, but it makes complete sense. And I think that's because my brain mashes things together in ways that other people's wouldn't, because they take a more predictable path through thinking through things, even if they're quite original thinkers, and mine goes off on its weird angles because of neurodivergence. It does make sense to people when I talk them through it. It's not so weird and out there that they go, no. Actually, no, some people go no, but a lot of the people who say
Yeah.
no to the political fandom thing are saying it because they either think it trivializes doesn't trivialize fandom, it trivializes politics to talk about it in that way, or they think, I'm not a fan. I'm just completely rational. And me going on about Brexit all the time is completely fine and normal. Like they reject it because they see themselves in it and they don't like it, but they don't reject the idea of me putting the things together. And I think that's quite a useful strength of neurodivergence, if you like, in that thinking about things differently means you come to new ideas that other people wouldn't necessarily have
Yeah,
thought.
like you used to seeing special interests and hyper focus, and also understand the kind of sort of being a divergent person kind of tend to trying to do a lot to understand your own, like looking at the idea of political fandoms. How would you define a fandom, and populism.
Yeah, for me, the fandom is the community that grows up around a shared interest where they talk to each other, because like lots of people love Taylor Swift and listen to her music, but to be a Swiftie, you're talking to other Taylor Swift fans, you're getting into the friendship bracelets and the lore of the songs and stuff like that. It's that interaction with other people and identifying yourself as a Swiftie that makes you part of the fandom run, the fan base. So pop is an interesting one because there's lots of different definitions of it. I think so lots of people will say populist when they mean it's popular and I don't really like it, or it's popular and I think it's unrealistic. To me, like the best definitions of pop are the ones where they talk about setting the people against the elite. And that's something that people like Donald Trump and Nigel Farage do, even though they're quite obviously the elite because Donald Trump's a billionaire. Nigel Farage was a banker. He's not really a man of the people, but they will go, the elite are lying to you about this, and then we, the people, will make it better. So there are fandoms that are of populist things, but it's not necessarily populism to be a fandom, because there's a fandom for, say, Just Stop Oil, and they're not really populist. They're neither populist nor popular in the sense that a lot of people really hate them and what they're doing.
Yeah, that thing of trying to find a political idea and make it popular, and that's something that's exploring the definitions in your book, and also looking at how it can present, because I know a lot of podcasts and commentators that looking at it through like the eyes of like Donald Trump and Nigel Farage, but you do have some people looking at populism from the left of politics, like Bernie Sanders, and the book does also give like an objective reflection of differences between political fandoms of left and the right, and kind of explaining the distinctions.
Yeah, because I definitely think there's been attempts to do left populism. Some of the people around Corbyn, or not necessarily Corbyn himself, were trying to do that. And obviously people seize on the for the many, not the few thing and go, oh, you see, that's populism, even though it was on all of the early New Labour stuff, was the same quote from Shelley. And New Labour were very open in a book called The Blair Revolution about trying to build a mass movement political party. They wanted Labour to have lots and lots of members. Like they ditched that once they actually got power, but that's what they initially wanted. I think the thing is, if you have a lot of people who like you, who are fans of you, who are behind what you're doing, it makes it easier for you to have like consent from the country beyond just getting elected to do what you're doing without so much resistance. People are going to be generally supportive of what you're doing. Like one of the problems Starmer's got is that he doesn't have any of that popular support. He doesn't have people who are fans of him or of the politics that he has, because it's quite poorly defined. So you've got people who are fans of the right of Labour, who support some of the people around him, but he doesn't have that popularity or undying support, like people who just
Yeah.
love him, whatever. And so at the moment, while he's making unpopular policy decisions and it's not really clear what he stands for, the polls for both him and the Labour Party and the people's perceptions of how well the government are doing are just very low. Like the levels of support are very low. And if he had that kind of swell of support that even like people like Boris Johnson had, God help us, he was actually quite
Yeah.
good by the time he was elected. If you have some of that behind you, it just gives you a bit of ballast against all of the people who are coming for you, and it just means that people, even if things are hard, what people will say is nobody else will be doing it better, or it's really difficult time.
You found out because they're all quite familiar that today, when PSM was on TV and is currently in recent polls more unpopular than Nigel Farage, and Nigel Farage becoming more popular than Keir Starmer, and that leads, like I know that a petition has been signed for like many people went in another election, and I think it's that thing of like where currently seems that there is not much of a clear positive vision to sell, then a lot of people at the minute are looking at either populist ideas or populist kind of can put the battle of us versus them, and So there is still a wave of populism going on in the background.
If you don't have anything to offer in
Yeah,
terms of hope and potential, then other people will capitalize on that. And you can't just go, we're not doing that anymore because we're the sensible people and we've come to crush all of that sort of thing, which is not very good
yeah,
either. You have to have something. Like Kamala Harris didn't have anything. She said she wouldn't do anything different from Biden. So all of the kind of early swell of support when she got Tim Walz and stuff like that disappeared. And fandom really peaks on potential rather than reality. It's always about what somebody could do. When you can project onto them all the things that you'd like them to do, that's part of why Farage is so popular, because he never has to actually act on anything. He just says what he would do, even though it's not a lot of the time like financially or legally or politically possible to do
yeah.
what he says. The potential of it makes people excited. The potential of Sanders made people excited. The potential of Corbyn made people excited. Potential of Trump first time round. And they were able to say at that time he didn't control all, so he just had to sign lots of executive orders that could be undone. But like this time round, it's actually going to be a bit harder for his fans, because not only is he going to be president again, so it's not the years in between where they can go, Trump would have done this, Trump would have done that, but also like he does control the House and the Senate as well as having the presidency. So if he doesn't get stuff done that they want him to get done, who are they going to blame? They can blame the Liberal elite up to a point, but if he controls everything, it starts to fall apart a bit.
Them talking being around the establishment against all mainstream political elite. If you have all the institutions of having a conservative Supreme Court, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative bodies, then you can have that establishment and that political elite. But in terms of like, how do you think that Trump did win the election? Do you think that all progressives and people who are trying to push for progressive political ideas, how do you think that is struggling?
Yeah, Trump won across sort of all demographics this time, not just white women, but and young men. But mostly how he won was Democrats staying home, just like a big part of how Starmer won was actually former conservative voters staying home. So one of the reasons he won was people with Democrats not turning out. The other one was the Democrats being incumbents and inflation being high. So a bunch of people would go, we can't afford groceries and gas. It's their fault. We'll try the other guy, or we just won't turn out. What progressives have to do is not listen to the terrible advisors that are around the Democrats who tell them to aim everything at the conservatives, because those people are just not going to vote for. Why would you vote for the diluted version of
Yeah,
right wingers when you could just vote for the right winger? Like if you have policies that are really like it works if you're different flavors of the right already, like the Tories have been able in the past to neutralize the threat of the right populists by taking on some of their policies, but that's because a lot of people want the right to be further right. That works. But if you're nominally the left or progressives, you cannot win by trying to out Republican the Republicans or trying to out Tory the Tories or even get close to them, because you might as well just vote for the original. And you have to have a positive thing for people to get behind. You have to have something that people are voting for and not just voting against the other lot. That's what gets you over the line, not just to win, but to have some of that popular support so you don't just lose the country really quickly.
I know a lot of the online content that the Kamala Harris campaign team was focusing on a sentiment of fear and a dread from what a Trump bans like ticket would deliver, and if they got a right Auschwitz, you were able to win that. But less focusing on pitching something of their own off and own their own ideals and like having their own policy platform. Yes, it's got something to do with not really going for a proper electoral thing of primaries and candidacies early on in the campaign, and the leadership's got switched up quite late on in the campaign in July. And so there's an element of that. But I guess it's that thing of with the focusing on the other side and not on your own side, that can lose votes because it's not as inspiring to go out and vote.
No, and also people just don't believe it because people lived through 4 years of a Trump government and the sky didn't fall in. Yes, because they control everything and because they're anti-democracy, there are worse things this time. But you project fear, just people just assume it's not going to be as bad as they say. The Brexit campaign, the pro Remain campaign was all it's going to be terrible if we leave, whereas the pro Brexit campaign is all these things that currently you don't like, they will go away if we leave. It'll all be sunlit uplands. Also, they're hyping up all of the terrible things, and if there is any pain, it'll be short term and nothing like as bad as they say. And people go, yeah, that seems reasonable. Fear turns out the people who are going to turn out for you anyway. It doesn't turn out the people who are undecided or maybe vote for the other side. That's the problem with fear.
Even though you could say that, right, that as you explore in the book, does work on, sentiment, fear, as in now that concept you explore in the book, what do you define as a negative fandom and fan system?
So a negative fandom is when people have the same sort of strength of feeling and identification and community, but about something they don't like as opposed to something they like. So their entire personality is about resisting Trump or hating Nigel Farage or hating Brexit, or for quite a long time, people hating Jeremy Corbyn. And they find other people who hate the same thing. So they've got that community, they've got that intensity of feeling, and they've got that sense of purpose about it. Like fighting that thing is what gives them a sense of purpose in their lives. Unpleasant that it's not as it having that kind of sense of hate about you is much less good for your soul than
Yeah.
having a positive project to work. And obviously some people, there's also, I talk about negative solidarity in the book, and that's because some political projects are about positive solidarity. You've got hope, you've got a project that's going to help poor people, or it's going to help the minorities, or it's going to make things better for rebuilding the NHS or building infrastructure or whatever like that. And you have negative ones that are like, we solve all of our problems by kicking out the immigrants or by being horrible to minorities or by crushing the woke. And those things can seem really tempting because it's much easier to whip up those kind of negative emotions than positive ones, because positive ones you can always kind of undermine with, oh, but that won't work or whatever. But they ultimately are quite destructive for you individually as a person and for society, really, to make people scared and sad. A nice place to be in if thing that you're working towards is about hate and destruction. You're just basically at war with your own people.
What's something you would really feel as some being a part of the community, being disabled, you would feel it opposes that use of negative solidarity, that destruction of destroying the future of immigrants, like getting immigrants out, and like everything is woke, and ideology that just to oppose minority groups and those who are already marginalised on the basis that it hopes some sort of inner phobia that like a popular figure like Nigel Farage has been able to eke out of people.
That's it. We've all got sort of late prejudices that we don't necessarily even know we have because of things we've brought up with, things that family have said, people around us have said, things that are in the media. And then they're not necessarily a big priority for us. But as I write about in the book, people like Farage and Trump can then activate those things. They're there. They're not making you feel things that you didn't feel. You already had those views. They haven't deluded you into having those views, but they weren't important to you. They weren't your top priority. They might not be a priority at all. But if they can make you think that thing you already think is actually really important and why things are going wrong, that's where they're able to animate those people into turning out to vote or to campaign, because they're like, okay, this is what's destroying our children or destroying our country, even though they're just basically quite minor, unexamined prejudices or not even true ideas, because there are campaigners in the sort of resisting Trump area or anti Brexit, anti centrist progressive area who are like Russian bots did all of this, or it's all these foreign actors trying to warp our politics. And while those things are there, they're not really as major a force as those people would like to think. But they have this kind of Cold War latent prejudice, Cold War latest prejudice in their mind that Russia or China is behind everything that's bad in the world, and it gives them an answer, and then they're able to people influencers in that space are able to make that a priority for people, and they can just go, oh, that's why people voted this way, or that's why this thing is happening, and they basically become conspiracy theorists. Even people who think they're on the correct side of politics, and in some ways they are, they're still capable of believing that there are these malign forces. There are malign forces. That there's this deep state thing going on, or these big Russian campaigns are actually having a massive impact on stuff, because it's easier than knowing that it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And you can't just turn one big button off and go, right, we'll block the Russians from the internet and then everything will be fine, or we'll do this other thing and everything will be fine.